Obviously, you should not watch funny games. Unless you really know what you're getting into. Even then, I wouldn't be so sure. This is a very small channel. I simply can't afford reviewers' insurance. So if you watch this movie and it causes prolonged trauma, don't blame me, please. For some people, the idea of being traumatized by a movie might be a little bit exciting. That might seem great. And it's these viewers that are the target audience of funny games. The target audience in more ways than one, perhaps. This is a brutal movie. Not so much in terms of what you actually see, I guess. Probably it would be rated R if it were rated in the United States. And we've talked about far more graphic movies on the channel. But Funny Games absolutely lives up to its reputation of being hard to watch. I avoided it for years. I'm not really a cinematic extremophile, but when I finally sat down to watch it, I was curious, maybe a little bit excited, mostly curious to see what all the fuss was about. And in this video, I'll tell you what it's about. I think I'll also probably run into one of my least favorite things that people tend to say about movies and that a lot of people have said about this one, but we'll get to that. First things first, Funny Games is a bit of a hybrid movie. This is perhaps its defining characteristic, and I think it's this, maybe even more than the violence that confounds and that frustrates a lot of people who have watched the movie. Mainly Funny Games is a combination of two things. It's kind of an art house social drama, but it's also a slasher movie. Slightly loose terminology there, some kind of disturbed horror thing, but also some kind of mature psychological realism thing. What happens when you combine the violence and the terror of a thriller with the immense intimacy and maturity of a social drama? You get something that nobody really wants to watch, even though it kind of delivers on the pieces, on the virtues of all those genres. We're introduced to these colliding ideas from the very beginning of the movie. We start off with some lovely classical music, a staple in a lot of Haneke films. I think this is the 5th film by Michael Haneke that we've covered on the channel, so go check out my videos for the other ones. You settle into this classical music. A family is playing a very middle-class, upper-middle-class guessing game where they try to name that tune. Actually, I think classical pieces are not technically referred to as tunes. Just as Anna takes a 3-2 lead, the opening credits come crashing in with some hardcore music. It might be tempting to call it heavy metal screamo, death metal, but the music actually comes from John Zorn, of all people, who is mainly an experimental jazz musician, but he had a few heavier projects, like one called Naked City, which made the music for this, although in the credits they just list his name. He made some heavier stuff there. John Zorn is one of the most eclectic musicians in history. He has tinkered with just about every genre on the planet, and one of these days, maybe he'll write a good song. Who knows? Let's leave my complicated feelings about John Zorn to another video, perhaps. But if you like Ennio Morricone and want to hear some covers of his music that do not really sound like his music, then check out The Big Gun Down. Interesting album, but truthfully, John Zorn, all of his music is very interesting. Anyway, these two types of music are cluing us into a lot of things about the movie from the very beginning, such as its two primary generic influences. And this isn't the first time that Haneke has looked to both of these influences at the same time. A movie like Caché, for instance, I have a video about that, is an intellectual film that is also kind of a thriller. And this is a common pattern to make a thoughtful movie that's not going to put people to sleep. Make it a little bit scary, right? Caché also shares some of the bigger themes of Haneke's career, which you'll find in this movie too. Ideas about the middle-class domestic life and its vulnerabilities. In Caché, Haneke is doing some balancing, right, between boring movie and exciting movie, and there's sort of balance and Funny Games here as well, but in this movie, it's way more extreme, and rather than using this balance to help out the audience, I guess Haneke's using it to assault them a little bit, although many of his movies are confrontational, but this one, it's the most confrontational. Something that's pretty interesting about Funny Games is that if you took out all of the sensitive moments, if you took out all the quiet parts, the movie would be a lot less intense. If you took out all the quiet parts, would it be louder? No, it would be quieter somehow. If this was just a horror movie, it wouldn't really be that wild. It wouldn't be that crazy. It would pale in comparison to some of the other crazy stuff that people have made down the years. Like I said, it's not really that graphic. But in horror movies, the contract with the audience is different. It is not so real, I guess. Horror movies are usually kind of fun. It's a type of escapism. Really, at least I think the best horror movies are ones that are, terrifying and frightening, but it's a game in some ways. It's kind of fun. Now, hey, this is Funny Games, and we'll talk about the title more later. It is gamified to some extent, and it has some of these horror tropes, but it is also just very intimate. What would really happen if you experienced a horror movie? Of course, the actual plot of the movie is fairly straightforward. Home invasion movie, but what would it actually be like to experience this? Terrible, basically. Anyway, you probably get the idea here. Two genres. Funny Games is more or less in a league of its own with this kind of thing, but there are a few comparisons to be made. It reminds me a little bit of A Clockwork Orange, for instance, particularly with the smugness of its villains. Some of Kieslowski's movies are in the same ballpark as well. It's a similar time period, of course. And maybe that Dutch movie, The Vanishing Spoorloos, also reminds me a little bit of this movie. Anyway, we're talking about the music. These two types of music are looking towards the different genres, right? But they are also alluding to different ways of making a movie. The style in Funny Games varies widely. Some of it is more naturalistic with long takes and intimate photography. This is the sort of thing that you would see in most Haneke films. Although, most of his movies experiment a little bit, but that's probably what he's known for. There are also parts that are extremely artificial. Most notable are the numerous times where the fourth wall is broken. Again, Haneke has done this in other movies, but nothing anywhere as extreme. The last thing about the music is that it points to at least one big theme of the movie, which is the boundaries of society, the social contract and its violation. Classical music is defined by traditions and codes. Hardcore music is interested in the opposite, in undermining that kind of thing, among other things. Big contrast here, and we'll come back to this probably. We're still sort of stuck on the opening credits here, but let me just say that overall, Funny Games is an extremely well-shot movie. For whatever reason, I thought that this would feel like a cheaper Haneke film. It is one of his earlier films. I thought it would feel more like an underground film, but not really. Haneke is one of the most precise directors to ever do it. I haven't seen the remake of this movie, and I'm not going to talk about it, but apparently it uses almost all the same shots, and that's not too surprising in a way. Haneke, I guess, felt like, hey, he got it right the first time. Once the movie really gets cooking, you might not be admiring the cinematography as much, but in the beginning, you can really feel the precision as we're introduced to the lake house and given a little taste of foreshadowing with the family dog, the golf clubs, the knives in the kitchen drawer. In some ways, Funny Games moves very slowly. Even as things really start to happen, it still moves slowly, and this is one of the reasons maybe that it's so agonizing. The film also has an immense feeling that something is about to happen. This is the product of a lot of subtle stylistic choices, or maybe it's just that there's no music. No soundtrack, no score. So we could talk about style all day. Again, Haneke, wow, what a master of his craft, what a precise filmmaker. But hey, it's probably more fun to talk about some things a little bit more controversial. With extreme movies, it's common to arrive at discussions of merit. In truth, Funny Games is rated pretty highly on IMDb, so maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill here, but I know it was controversial at various times. And I know that people have asked questions like, well, should they even have made this? Or they've said things like, they shouldn't have made it. It's an affront to everything decent in the world. Why is this being shown at the Cannes Film Festival? And so on. And actually, I think these are all reasonable things to say in some ways. Obviously, Funny Games is a provocative movie. For some people, that's the end of the story, I guess. But I don't know. Some people will tell you, oh, no, you don't get it. The movie's supposed to be provocative. Don't worry about it, right? But is that really the intellectual high ground? Just because something is provocative, that doesn't mean that it's good or bad, necessarily. It doesn't mean much at all to me. I like movies, personally, that provoke things in a profound way, that stir up ideas and emotions that are hard to experience in any other way, hard to confront in any other way. And it can be cool when a movie challenges the audience. Great. On the other hand, I'm not that interested in movies that feel like they shock just for the sake of it. I think Haneke is usually safely in the former territory, but with The Piano Teacher, he gets a little closer to Shockville. I have a video about that, of course. He gets a little bit closer to Shocktown. And with this movie, he is really on the border. He's really on the border. It might be telling that this is one of his earlier movies, and I think his filmmaking possibly evolved a little bit since then. This film, Funny Games, attracts some people who maybe wouldn't have seen any other Michael Haneke movies because they've heard how extreme it is. It attracts some extremophile tourists just looking for a crazy movie, and that's fine. But I think Haneke had some other stuff that is better. One problem with discussing the merit of Funny Games, besides the fact that it's not really that interesting, but one problem that I think confounds a lot of people is that it's hard to agree on what kind of movie it is in the first place, and it's sort of hard to say anything about the merit of it if you don't know what it's kind of trying to do, or if you can't agree on what it's trying to do. And as I've been saying, it's sort of this weird hybrid movie. I think this can frustrate people. Maybe you really like Amour and Code Unknown. I have a video about Code Unknown, of course, go watch it. So, hey, you go and you watch Funny Games, and it's like getting hit by a train. But maybe you heard about this movie because it was on a list of the 13 most twisted films right after Saw, and then maybe you come to it and you say, oh, it's too boring or something. I don't know. Even the most pretentious viewers, honestly, could be in two minds about the film, because you could start from other Haneke films and say, well, this is worse. Or you could start from a mainstream horror movie about a home invasion and say, well, hey, this is much better. Isn't this a big improvement over that? So, yeah, Funny Games kind of defies classification a little bit, and that makes it hard to agree on how successful it is in some ways. One thing that a lot of people say about this movie to try to wrap their heads around it is that it's a critique of violence, or even that it's a critique of violence in movies. Wow. I think most of the time that people say these phrases, they're in the process of being wrong, or maybe just a bit unrigorous. If you or someone you know is planning on saying this in the future, I would advise you just to be careful, because first of all, often it simply isn't true to say that something is a critique of violence or whatever. You hear people talk about Tarantino this way, for instance. Oh, no, man, you don't understand it. It's a critique of foot fetishes. Martin Scorsese also. Oh, no, it's a critique of masculinity. Oh, it's not glamorizing. What are you talking about? No, you don't get it. Usually, this is kind of a blanket comeback for people who happen to like violent movies, which is not a sin by any means. Although if the Ten Commandments were written today, it probably would be. Anyway, let's discount these cases where there is obviously stylization and glamorization going on, which frankly is most movies. And most of the time that people say, oh, it's a critique, well, it's usually not that complicated. It's usually a little bit more complicated than that. Another problem with this assertion, though, maybe a more significant one, is that it isn't really a complete thought. I guess what people mean is that there's some insight to be found. Yeah, it's violent, but hey, it's not just violence for the sake of it. There's some insight to be found. But what is it, right? That's the interesting question, surely. With Funny Games, it's not too hard to sketch out a case in this critique direction. Some of the fourth wall moments in particular seem to point to the audience, don't they? There's a moment where one of the characters says, well, we can't stop now because the movie wouldn't be long enough. Huh? There is almost an implication here that this is what the audience wants to see. You want more violence. You want this, right? Now, I don't think many people who are watching Funny Games want the sort of violence that they see in Funny Games, right? It's such a harrowing movie. That doesn't really make sense. But maybe Haneke is looking towards other movies, more mainstream violent films. And there's a lot of them, right? There's a lot of violent movies out there. And maybe he's saying, you want this in some ways. Perhaps this is how Funny Games is critiquing violence or violence in films. Oh, you like watching home invasion movies, but when we show you what it's really like, hey, you don't like it so much now, do you? In fact, you might be strangely drawn to the mental anguish in a movie like Saw, but you don't like it when you see it here, do you? Well, okay. There might be something to this, but I'm not totally convinced, to be honest. For one thing, I'm not sure that this escapist cartoon violence is actually bad. When you watch a horror movie, like I said, the contract with the audience is different. You're doing a different thing than when you watch Funny Games, for the most part. So, of course, it's going to feel different. And is it bad that some movies use violence as a plot point? I don't know. I mean, good luck answering that question definitively. I don't think Haneke is interested in that sort of moralism. He's not a very moralistic guy for most of his career. A tricky thing about Funny Games is that as much as it seems to be a somber movie, a somber movie that might have something to prove, right, might be leaning towards this moralistic direction, it also has moments where it doesn't take itself seriously at all. Moments where it seems to hint that all the serious and harrowing violence in this movie is pointless as well. This movie kind of short-circuits itself a few times. When it comes to violence, Funny Games is a Mobius strip. It shows how harrowing violence is. It shows us violence not as something done with a weapon, but as a psychological act. But on the other hand, the movie does lavish in violence, almost undeniably so. It does toy with the audience. Ask yourself this. What is the game in Funny Games? Is it the scheme that the two villains are carrying out in the movie? Or is it the movie itself? Who is the joke on here? The people who hate the movie and say it's too violent? Or the people who like it and say, don't worry, guys, it's a critique on violence? You know, the original German title of this movie translates to Why Violence in Film is Bad. Actually, the original title is Funny Games, in English, notably. And I don't know, I think it's plausible that the victims of this movie are the audience. If so, wouldn't you feel a little bit silly praising how thoughtful it is? Point is that this is an unstable movie, especially when it comes to violence. It's doing two different things at once, at least two different things at once here. It's unstable. So is it a critique of violence or of cinematic violence? I don't think that really gets to the heart of what's going on here at all. I think we're kind of walking in the wrong direction when we say that. Obviously, to some degree, it is a movie about violence, sure. Some people also say something very similar about this movie being a satire, which again sells things pretty short. It's similar to saying, hey, it's provocative. I don't think any of those statements really quite get us to the meat of this movie. With all its contradictions and inversions, it's no surprise that Funny Games will make sparks fly. Again, I think this is all kind of rooted in the movie being this hybrid. It's a confounding result, and that is, in some ways, the point, I guess. Let's get off this topic. Because as extreme as Funny Games is, I think the truth is that this is a pretty deep movie with lots of interesting themes beyond just violence, lots of stuff to talk about. And we've touched on a couple of them already. We do have the disruption of middle-class domestic life, like in many Hanukkah films. This is a little bigger in the early parts of the film. You kind of forget about it later on. The movie doesn't really set up this family as victims at first, it seems. You might even expect to learn about some skeletons they have in their closet. At first, it seems like, this is like a little too upper middle class for these guys to be the good guys, right? Well, but then the villains are kind of even more posh in some ways. A lot of thrillers tend to pull the bad guys from the fringes of society, but that isn't what is happening here. Another interesting thing about Funny Games, by the way, is that the events aren't quite plausible. In many ways, this is a very detailed and serious movie. It's very sort of carefully planned, lots and lots of details. For instance, you see this first interaction between the family and their neighbors, and you don't quite know what's going on, but then later, as more is revealed, it kind of all makes sense now, right? So it's sort of a clockwork movie in some ways, but on the other hand, the crime at the center of it doesn't really make any sense at all. We fall into some classic horror tropes when the family can't figure out any way to escape, or when they bump into their other neighbors and can't figure out anything to say or any way to communicate. Almost plausible, but it's not. It's interesting, by the way, that these crooks, they don't bring any weapons to this crime they're going to commit. That doesn't really make sense, but it's another thing to consider when thinking about the violence. Right? A lot of the violence here is carried out with a golf club. Of course, you never really know what the bad guys really want, what they're really up to, who they are. They do offer some explanations in that direction, but it's sort of clear that they're lying. It's interesting that in those directions, they actually do invoke some of the fringes of society, sort of almost parodying what you might find as a criminal motive in other films. But yeah, we have quite an abstract plot in some ways. It's another aspect where Hanukkah is kind of toying with the audience a little bit. You know what's going on as much as the family knows what's going on, which is not much. The story is so bare at times that it feels a bit like a play, a Pinteresque abstraction over the act of violence and the act of cruelty in some ways, like the details. For some reason, the details don't even really matter. It doesn't even matter exactly what they're up to. Is this insightful, or is it a little bit of a weak point? I'm not totally sure, but interesting to think about how sort of implausible certain parts of the movie is and how loose certain parts of the movie are and how abstract the plot is. Of course, one of the big themes here is power. The villains wield it smugly. Wielding power smugly. You call that bullying? Maybe. You wonder if this is alluding to something in particular out in the world. I'm not sure. Haneke probably couldn't have anticipated U.S. foreign policy in 2025. An idea that runs through the movie is that these guys are maybe doing it for the sake of doing it. Again, alluding to some current events, doing it because they can. Power for the sake of power. I honestly don't think that's that common in the world, but it turns out there are people like that. Yeah. There's also something to be said, I guess, about the relationship between the two villains. This would not be the last Haneke movie to examine some of the structures around bad things happening. I'm not going to say the nature of evil. I'm not going to say it. I think this is approaching most of what I had to say about funny games. There's a lot of depth here. There's other themes we could talk about. In some ways, they kind of disappear a little bit off the radar because the movie is so extreme. You spend most of the film kind of being traumatized. There's not a lot of time spent like, interesting. And I think that ultimately the movie does have a complex legacy because of how extreme it is. And look, I think it's fair to praise something for being provocative and fair to criticize something for being provocative, both, right? Those things could both make sense, even the same thing. It's a complicated legacy, but overall, I think I like this movie. It lives up to its reputation, definitely. It is extreme. It is unstable, but it does have some depth. On the other hand, I think it is the worst Michael Haneke movie I've ever seen.